What happens when a millionaire CEO decides to humiliate someone he considers beneath him, only to discover that intelligence and education can't be judged by a uniform? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man whose mop and bucket concealed secrets that would shake the foundations of one of New York's most prestigious law firms. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected sources. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The glass towers of Manhattan's financial district cast long shadows over the bustling streets below, but none stood taller or more imposing than the headquarters of Sterling & Associates, one of the city's most elite corporate law firms. 43 floors of polished marble, imported mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the Hudson River. It was a monument to success, power, and the kind of old-money prestige that intimidated clients and competitors alike. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, the autumn sun streamed through the massive windows of the 42nd floor conference room, where the firm's most senior partners had gathered for their monthly strategy meeting. The room itself was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, a 30-foot mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, original oil paintings of long-dead Supreme Court justices adorning the walls, and a view that made visitors feel simultaneously inspired and insignificant. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling I Vieth, the 48-year-old managing partner whose great-grandfather had founded the firm in 1923. With his silver hair perfectly styled, his Armani suit immaculately tailored, and his Harvard Law class ring catching the morning light, Richard embodied everything the firm represented: tradition, excellence, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. His net worth exceeded $50 million, a fortune built not just on his legal acumen but on his family's generations of connections and influence. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted, "today we're discussing the Morrison Industries acquisition. This deal will either make us the premier corporate law firm on the East Coast, or it'll be a cautionary tale about overreach." He gestured toward the stack of documents before him, each bound in leather and bearing the firm's distinctive gold seal. Around the table sat the firm's inner circle: Jonathan Hayes, the silver-haired litigation partner whose reputation for destroying witnesses in cross-examination was legendary; David Chen, the mergers and acquisitions specialist whose Wharton MBA and photographic memory made him indispensable; Patricia Whitman, the only female senior partner whose icy demeanor and razor-sharp intellect had earned her both respect and fear; and Thomas Bradford, the youngest partner at 35, whose Yale pedigree and family connections had fast-tracked. The conference room door opened with barely a whisper, and Marcus Thompson entered carrying his cleaning cart. At 41 years old, Marcus was unremarkable in the way that invisible people often are: medium height, brown hair starting to show gray at the temples, wearing the standard-issue navy blue uniform of Morrison Janitorial Services. His work boots made soft squeaking sounds on the polished marble floor as he maneuvered his cart to the far corner of the room, where a coffee station had been set up for the meeting. The lawyers barely glanced in his direction. To them, Marcus was part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and unnoticed as the air conditioning or the elevators. He had been cleaning their offices for 3 years, arriving before dawn and working through the early morning hours when the building was empty except for security guards and the occasional associate pulling an all-nighter. Marcus moved with quiet efficiency, replacing the water in the coffee machine, restocking the expensive imported coffee pods, and wiping down surfaces that were already spotless. His movements were practiced and unobtrusive, the result of years perfecting the art of being invisible in spaces where his presence was tolerated but not acknowledged. "The Morrison deal represents more than just revenue," Richard continued, completely ignoring Marcus's presence. "It's about positioning ourselves as the go-to firm for Fortune 500 acquisitions. Morrison Industries has been family-owned for 4 generations, and they're finally ready to sell. The buyer is a consortium of private equity firms with deep pockets and deeper ambitions." Jonathan Hayes leaned forward, his expensive fountain pen tapping against his legal pad. "What's our competition looking like? I assume Cromwell and Partners is circling." "Naturally," Richard replied with a dismissive wave, "but they don't have our track record with family-owned businesses. The Morrisons are old school. They value tradition, reputation, and," he paused meaningfully, "breeding. They're not going to trust their life's work to some nouveau riche firm full of state school graduates. Patricia Whitman's lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. The preliminary documents are impressive, but there are some unusual clauses in the proposed contract. Several sections are written in what appears to be archaic legal language, almost like they're trying to invoke some kind of historical precedent. Thomas Bradford, eager to prove his worth among the more senior partners, shuffled through his papers. Actually, there's one section that's completely puzzling. It's written entirely in Latin, and our usual translators are having trouble with it. It seems to reference some kind of ancient Roman commercial law. David Chen pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit from his Harvard days. Latin in a modern commercial contract? That's either pretentious beyond belief, or there's something significant we're missing. Marcus had finished restocking the coffee station and was now quietly emptying wastebaskets around the room, moving like a shadow along the periphery of their conversation. His expression remained neutral, professional, as he went about his work, but his ears were attuned to every word. Richard Sterling leaned back in his chair, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and absolute authority. The Morrisons are known for their eccentricities. The current patriarch, William Morrison Jr., graduated from Princeton in 1968 with a classics degree before taking over the family business. Apparently, he believes that understanding the historical foundations of law gives modern contracts more gravitas. More likely it's a way to exclude lawyers who didn't have the advantage of an Ivy League classical education, Jonathan Hayes muttered, though not without some approval in his tone. The morning sun had shifted, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the conference table. Marcus had moved to cleaning the windows, his movements methodical and silent as he worked around the seated lawyers. To them, he might as well have been a robot, present but not truly there, serving a function but possessing no thoughts or opinions worth considering. The real question, Patricia continued, is whether this Latin section is purely ceremonial, or if it contains substantive legal provisions that could affect the deal structure. If we can't properly interpret it, we're essentially flying blind on a $50 million transaction. Thomas Bradford seized the opportunity to demonstrate his value to the partnership. I could reach out to the Classics Department at Columbia, see if they have any scholars who specialize in legal Latin. It might take a few days, but... A few days? Richard's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. Morrison's board meets on Friday. We need answers now, not after some professor finishes his afternoon tea and gets around to our little problem. The room fell silent except for the almost inaudible sound of Marcus's cloth moving across the window glass. The lawyers sat in contemplative frustration, each aware that their prestigious educations and expensive degrees had hit an unexpected wall. Harvard Law School, Yale, Wharton, Princeton, none of their elite institutions had prepared them for a situation where their credentials might not be sufficient. David Chen broke the silence first. Maybe we're overthinking this. How complex could it really be? Legal Latin follows pretty standard patterns. We could probably puzzle it out with a good dictionary and some time. Or, Richard said, his voice taking on a tone that his partners recognized as dangerous, we could ask someone who actually knows Latin. His eyes had fixed on Marcus, who was now cleaning the brass fixtures near the door. After all, surely the cleaning staff at such a prestigious firm must be well versed in classical languages. The sarcasm in Richard's voice was unmistakable, and the other partners responded with the kind of knowing chuckles that powerful people share when they're about to witness someone else's humiliation. Marcus continued his work, apparently oblivious to the building tension in the room. "Excuse me," Richard called out in the tone one might use to address a particularly slow child. "Maintenance man. Yes, you with the mop." Marcus turned slowly, his expression politely inquiring. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can help you with?" The partners exchanged amused glances. Here was Richard Sterling in his element, about to demonstrate the natural order of things, the hierarchy that kept the world spinning properly on its axis. "As it happens, there is," Richard said, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "We're having a little problem with some Latin text, and I was wondering if you might be able to help us out." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard Sterling's smile widened as he watched Marcus approach the conference table, still holding his cleaning cloth. The other partners had stopped pretending to work on their documents, sensing that their managing partner was about to provide some entertainment at the expense of the hired help. This was the kind of moment that reinforced the natural order of their world, a reminder of why they sat at mahogany tables while others cleaned around them. "You see," Richard continued, his voice dripping with mock courtesy, "we have this rather challenging piece of text here. It's in Latin, and despite our combined decades of legal education from the finest institutions in the country, we seem to be having a bit of trouble with it." He gestured theatrically toward the leather-bound document. "I thought perhaps someone with your background might have some insight." Jonathan Hayes couldn't suppress a chuckle. "Richard, I think you might be overestimating our friend's educational opportunities." Marcus stood quietly beside the table, his cleaning cloth still in his hands, his expression unchanged. Years of working in environments where he was treated as furniture had taught him to control his reactions, to present a neutral face regardless of the circumstances. But behind his calm exterior, he was calculating, observing, filing away every word and gesture for future reference. "Oh, I don't know," Patricia Whitman added, her voice carrying a false sweetness that made her words more cutting. "I'm sure he picked up some Latin during his extensive studies at— where was it you went to school?" She looked at Marcus expectantly, as if genuinely curious about his academic background. Thomas Bradford, desperate to ingratiate himself with the senior partners, decided to join the sport. Maybe he learned it in night school. "I hear they offer some fascinating courses at the community colleges these days. Latin for janitors might be a popular elective." The laughter that followed was soft but unmistakable, the kind of refined cruelty that people with breeding never raise their voices for. David Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the only partner who seemed to recognize the ugliness of what was happening. But his discomfort wasn't enough to make him speak up against his colleagues. Richard reached for the document, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "Here, let me show you what we're dealing with." He lifted a page from the contract, holding it up like a professor displaying a particularly complex theorem to first-year students. "This is the problematic section right here. It's a full paragraph of Latin, and apparently it's crucial to understanding the legal framework of this $50 million deal." Marcus set his cleaning cloth down on his cart and took a step closer to the table, his movements unhurried and professional. "Would you like me to take a look, sir?" The question was asked in the same tone Marcus used when inquiring whether a wastebasket needed emptying or a window required additional attention. But something in his voice, a subtle shift in inflection perhaps, or a barely perceptible change in posture, made Richard pause for just a moment. It was as if the janitor had momentarily dropped a mask, revealing something unexpected beneath. "Oh, absolutely," Richard recovered quickly, his amusement returning in full force. "Please, by all means, enlighten us with your scholarly interpretation." He placed the document on the table and gestured grandly. "Don't be shy now. We're all very eager to learn from your expertise." Marcus approached the table and leaned forward slightly to read the text. The partners watched with barely concealed glee, anticipating the moment when the cleaning man would stammer out some apologetic admission of ignorance. This was their world, a place where intelligence was measured by degrees from prestigious universities, where worth was determined by family connections and trust fund balances, where people like Marcus existed solely to maintain the environment in which their betters conducted important business. But as Marcus's eyes moved across the Latin text, his expression began to change. The neutral, service-oriented mask he wore during his cleaning duties started to slip away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like scholarly concentration. His brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion but in the way of someone parsing complex syntax and weighing subtle meanings. "This is interesting," Marcus said quietly, his voice taking on a different quality, more precise, more confident. "This particular passage appears to be derived from Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, specifically the Digesti, but with some modifications that suggest the author was familiar with both Roman commercial law and medieval canon law interpretations." The laughter around the table died abruptly. Richard's smile faltered as he processed what he had just heard. The cleaning man had not only recognized the Latin text, but had identified its specific legal and historical origins with the kind of precision that suggested deep, scholarly knowledge. Jonathan Hayes was the first to recover his voice. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Marcus straightened up and looked directly at the litigation partner, his demeanor no longer that of a subservient employee. I said this text draws from the Digesti, the legal opinions compiled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, but whoever wrote this modern version has incorporated elements from medieval interpretations, particularly those developed by the canonists of the 12th and 13th centuries. The silence that followed was profound. 5 of New York's most successful lawyers sat frozen, staring at a man they had dismissed as intellectually inferior, watching him demonstrate a command of legal history that exceeded their own. David Chen's mouth was actually hanging open. Patricia Whitman's carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing genuine shock. Thomas Bradford looked as if someone had just explained that his Ivy League degree was printed on toilet paper. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his finger tracing a line of Latin text as he continued his analysis. The specific phrase here, obligationes ex contractu in perpetuum vinculum, this is particularly sophisticated. It's creating a contractual obligation that binds not just the immediate parties but their successors in perpetuity. It's similar to the concept of privity of estate in English common law, but with a Roman law foundation that makes it more comprehensive. Richard Sterling's face had gone through several color changes during this explanation, finally settling on a shade that matched the expensive burgundy leather of his chair. His carefully cultivated image as the intellectual superior, the natural leader of lesser mortals, was crumbling with each word that came out of Marcus's mouth. Furthermore, Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he was causing in the perfectly ordered world of Sterling and Associates. This clause here, si qui contrafecerit, poena dupli tenitur, establishes a penalty clause where violators are liable for double damages. But the interesting part is how it's structured. The Latin construction suggests that the penalty applies not just to direct violations, but to any action that undermines the spirit of the agreement. Patricia Whitman found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Where did you learn to read Latin like that? For the first time since beginning his impromptu translation, Marcus smiled. It wasn't the apologetic, deferential expression the partners were accustomed to seeing from service workers. It was the quiet, confident smile of someone who had just revealed a trump card he had been holding for a very long time. "Well, ma'am," Marcus said, his tone returning to something approximating the respectful manner of a cleaning service employee, "you pick things up here and there." The inadequacy of this explanation hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. No one picked up the ability to analyze 6th-century legal texts and medieval canon law interpretations. That kind of knowledge required years of formal study, advanced degrees, and the type of intellectual rigor that supposedly separated the partners of Sterling and Associates from the rest of humanity. Thomas Bradford, still struggling to process what he had witnessed, managed to stammer out, "But that's graduate-level classical scholarship. That's the kind of analysis you'd expect from a professor of medieval history or someone with a doctorate in classics." Marcus began moving back toward his cleaning cart, his brief moment of intellectual authority apparently over. "Is there anything else you need help with, gentlemen?" "Ms. Whitman, I have several more floors to finish before my shift ends." But Richard Sterling wasn't ready to let this moment pass. His shock was rapidly transforming into something uglier, a desperate need to reassert his dominance, to restore the natural order that had just been so thoroughly disrupted. "Wait just a minute," he said, his voice sharp with authority. "You can't just walk away after that performance." Marcus paused, one hand on his cleaning cart, and looked back at the managing partner with an expression of polite inquiry. "Sir? Where did you really learn Latin?" Richard demanded. "Community college doesn't offer courses in medieval canon law. Neither does night school, so where? What's your story?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Richard wasn't just asking about Marcus's educational background. He was demanding an explanation for how the rigid hierarchy of his world had just been turned upside down. He was asking how someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior had just demonstrated knowledge that none of his expensively educated partners possessed. Marcus considered the question for a long moment, his face unreadable. The other partners waited, sensing that they were on the verge of learning something that would change their understanding of the man they had ignored for 3 years. "I suppose," Marcus said finally, "that's a conversation for another time." He turned back to his cart and began pushing it toward the door. "I hope the translation helps with your Morrison Industries deal. It sounds like an important transaction." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind 5 of New York's most powerful lawyers sitting in stunned silence around their mahogany table, staring at a Latin document that had just revealed more than they had ever bargained for. The service elevator descended silently toward the basement levels of Sterling and Associates, carrying Marcus Thompson away from the chaos he had just unleashed on the 42nd floor. As the numbers on the display counted down, 41, 40, 39, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The expression that crossed his face was nothing like the deferential politeness he had maintained in the conference room. This was the smile of a chess master who had just executed a move his opponents wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The elevator came to a stop at B2, the basement level that housed the building's mechanical systems, storage rooms, and employee facilities. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart through the utilitarian corridors, past humming HVAC units and electrical panels, toward the small locker room where the janitorial staff changed clothes and stored their personal belongings. But instead of heading directly to his assigned locker, Marcus made a detour to a maintenance closet at the far end of the corridor, a room that, according to the building's official floor plans, contained spare cleaning supplies and equipment. Marcus pulled out a key card from his uniform pocket, but this wasn't the standard issue card given to Morrison Janitorial Services employees. This card was black with gold trim, the kind of premium access card typically reserved for building management or high-level tenants. He swiped it through the electronic lock, and the door clicked open to reveal something far different from what any casual observer might expect. The maintenance closet was actually a fully equipped office space, complete with multiple computer monitors, a high-end ergonomic chair, filing cabinets, and communications equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the partners upstairs were using. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes that would have made any university classics department envious: original editions of Justinian's Code, medieval legal commentaries, Renaissance treatises on Roman law, and modern scholarly works on legal history. Marcus hung up his janitor's uniform in a small wardrobe and retrieved a pressed white dress shirt and charcoal gray slacks from a garment bag. As he changed clothes, his entire demeanor shifted. The slightly stooped posture he maintained while pushing a cleaning cart straightened into the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The deferential expression gave way to the sharp, analytical look of a scholar and strategist. From a locked drawer in the desk, Marcus retrieved a secure tablet and activated an encrypted communication application. Within moments, he was connected to a video call with a woman sitting in what appeared to be a corporate boardroom 3,000 miles away. "Dr. Thompson," the woman said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of high-level corporate communication, "I trust the demonstration went according to plan?" Marcus, or rather Dr. Marcus Thompson, settled into his chair and looked directly into the camera. "Better than expected, Sarah." Richard Sterling took the bait completely. The arrogance was even more pronounced than our psychological profile suggested. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Vice President of Morrison Industries, nodded with satisfaction. She was a sharp-featured woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of intense focus that came from managing a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "And the legal analysis? Were you able to identify all the trap clauses we embedded in the contract?" "Every single one," Marcus confirmed. The Latin sections were particularly effective. Sterling's team has no idea they're looking at a document designed to test their thoroughness and intellectual honesty. The penalty clauses alone would bankrupt them if they proceed without understanding the full implications. The conversation was revealing layers of deception that the partners of Sterling and Associates couldn't have imagined. The Morrison Industries acquisition wasn't just a business opportunity. It was an elaborate test, designed to evaluate the character and competence of the law firm that would potentially handle billions of dollars in corporate transactions. "Tell me about the individual reactions," Sarah continued. "Our board needs to understand exactly what kind of people we'd be dealing with if we move forward with Sterling and Associates." Marcus pulled up files on his tablet, each containing detailed psychological profiles and behavioral assessments. "Richard Sterling is exactly what we suspected. Intellectually arrogant, dismissive of anyone he considers beneath his social class, and fundamentally unprepared for complex legal challenges that require actual scholarship rather than just connections. When faced with something outside his expertise, his first instinct was mockery rather than intellectual curiosity." He scrolled through additional notes, images, and recorded conversations. Jonathan Hayes shows similar patterns. Quick to join in humiliating someone he perceives as inferior, but lacks the analytical skills for complex historical legal interpretation. David Chen appears to have some ethical concerns about the behavior of his colleagues, but lacks the courage to voice them when it matters. And the others? Patricia Whitman is perhaps the most dangerous, Marcus continued. She's intelligent enough to recognize when she's outmatched, but her response is to become more calculating rather than more humble. She'll be the first to try to figure out who I really am and what this all means. Thomas Bradford is ambitious but inexperienced. He'll follow wherever he thinks the power lies. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the information. Your assessment matches what we've heard from other sources. Sterling & Associates has a reputation for taking on high-profile cases they're not fully equipped to handle, then relying on their social connections to smooth over any deficiencies in their actual legal work. Marcus nodded, then pulled up another screen showing financial records and case histories. The firm's track record supports that assessment. In the past 5 years, they've been involved in 3 major corporate transactions that resulted in significant legal complications down the road. In each case, the problems could have been avoided with more thorough analysis of historical legal precedents and international law implications. The kind of analysis that requires actual scholarship rather than just prestigious degrees, Sarah observed. Exactly. And that brings us to the larger question, whether Morrison Industries should trust them with the most important transaction in the company's history. The video call continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus providing detailed assessments of Sterling & Associates' capabilities, character flaws, and potential risks. But the conversation revealed something even more significant about Marcus himself. This wasn't just an employee reporting to his boss. The dynamic between Marcus and Sarah suggested a relationship between equals, between professionals who had worked together on complex, high-stakes operations before. There's something else, Marcus said as the call was winding down. I've been monitoring their internal communications and case management systems. Sterling & Associates has been making some interesting connections lately, reaching out to firms with questionable reputations, exploring partnerships that would give them access to clients they couldn't attract on their own merits. Sarah's expression sharpened. What kind of partnerships? Marcus pulled up financial records and communication logs that painted a troubling picture. They've been courting Blackstone and Reed, the firm that was sanctioned last year for fraudulent billing practices. They're also exploring a merger with Continental Legal Services, which has been linked to several money laundering investigations. It seems Sterling is more interested in expanding their client base than maintaining their ethical standards. That's concerning, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely surprised. It confirms our suspicions about their priorities. The call ended with arrangements for Marcus to continue his observation and intelligence gathering for the remainder of the week. But as he powered down the secure communications equipment, Marcus reflected on the deeper purpose of his mission. Morrison Industries wasn't just testing Sterling & Associates. They were conducting a comprehensive evaluation of the entire legal and financial ecosystem that surrounded major corporate transactions. Marcus Thompson's real identity was far more complex than anything the partners upstairs could have imagined. Dr. Marcus Thompson held a Ph.D. in medieval history from Oxford University, with a specialty in the development of commercial law from Roman times through the Renaissance. He had also earned a J.D. from Harvard Law School, graduating summa cum laude and serving as editor of the Harvard Law Review. His doctoral dissertation on the influence of Justinian's Code on modern corporate law had been published by Cambridge University Press and was considered the definitive work on the subject. But Marcus's academic credentials were only part of the story. For the past 8 years, he had worked as a consultant for major corporations, conducting what the industry euphemistically called due diligence assessments of professional service firms. His specialty was going undercover in law firms, accounting companies, and investment banks to evaluate their actual competence, ethical standards, and cultural dynamics before his clients entrusted them with critical business matters. The janitorial position at Sterling & Associates was just his latest assignment, but it had already revealed more than previous operations. Over 3 years of emptying trash cans and cleaning windows, Marcus had observed dozens of meetings, reviewed hundreds of discarded documents, and built comprehensive psychological profiles of every senior member of the firm. He had access to their private conversations, their unguarded moments of honesty, and their behind-the-scenes decision-making processes. What he had discovered was deeply troubling. Sterling and Associates had built their reputation on family connections and social prestige rather than legal expertise. They regularly took on cases beyond their capabilities, then relied on intimidation, social pressure, and strategic delays to avoid accountability when problems arose. Their billing practices were questionable, their ethical standards were flexible, and their actual legal knowledge was often superficial. The Latin document test had been designed specifically to exploit these weaknesses. Morrison Industries' legal team had created a contract filled with sophisticated legal concepts that required genuine scholarship to understand. Any competent law firm should have immediately recognized the need for expert consultation and thorough analysis. Instead, Sterling and Associates had treated it as an opportunity for cruel entertainment, revealing both their intellectual limitations and their moral failings. As Marcus prepared to return to his janitorial duties, he considered the implications of what would happen next. The partners upstairs were probably still sitting around their conference table, trying to process what they had witnessed. Some would be curious about his background. Others would be threatened by the challenge to their assumptions. A few might even begin to suspect that their perfect little world of privilege and prejudice was about to be seriously disrupted. But none of them would guess the full truth, that the man they had dismissed as intellectually inferior was actually one of the most qualified legal scholars in the country, and that their casual cruelty had just cost them the most important client opportunity in their firm's history. 3 days had passed since the Latin incident in the conference room, and the atmosphere at Sterling and Associates had become increasingly tense. Richard Sterling found himself unable to concentrate on his cases, haunted by the image of a janitor casually analyzing 6th-century legal texts with the fluency of a medieval scholar. He had ordered his assistant to conduct a background check on Marcus Thompson, but the results had been frustratingly ordinary. High school graduate, no college records, 3 years of employment with Morrison Janitorial Services, clean criminal background, unremarkable credit history. But Richard's instincts, honed by decades of legal practice, told him that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. No one learned to read Justinian's Code from watching YouTube videos or browsing Wikipedia. The kind of analysis Marcus had provided required years of formal education and deep scholarly engagement with historical legal texts. On Friday morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to corner Marcus during his cleaning rounds. He wanted answers, and he was prepared to use whatever leverage necessary to get them. But as he stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor, he was greeted by his assistant, Diane, who looked uncharacteristically flustered. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice tight with anxiety, "there are people here to see you. They're waiting in the main conference room." "People? What people?" "I don't have any appointments until 10. "They said they're from Morrison Industries," Diane replied. "And they specifically asked for you and all the senior partners to be present." Richard's blood ran cold. Morrison Industries wasn't supposed to make their final decision about legal representation until next week. An unscheduled visit could only mean one of two things. Either they were accelerating the timeline for some reason, or something had gone seriously wrong with the deal. "Get everyone to the conference room immediately," Richard ordered. "Hayes, Chen, Whitman, Bradford, all of them, now." 20 minutes later, the senior partners of Sterling and Associates sat around their mahogany conference table, facing 3 representatives from Morrison Industries. Sarah Mitchell, the senior vice president they had spoken with earlier in the week, was flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who had introduced themselves as the company's general counsel and head of corporate security. "Thank you for accommodating this last-minute meeting," Sarah began, her voice carrying an ominous formality. "We've completed our evaluation of Sterling and Associates, and we wanted to deliver our decision in person." Richard leaned forward, his confidence wavering. "Of course. We're eager to hear your thoughts on our proposal." "Before we discuss our decision," Sarah continued, "I'd like to address the Latin document that was included in our preliminary contract materials. I understand there was some difficulty in interpreting those sections." Patricia Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "We were planning to consult with classical scholars at Columbia University. The text was more complex than typical commercial language." "Complex, yes," Sarah agreed, "but not beyond the capabilities of a properly qualified legal team. The Latin sections were drawn from well-known historical sources and represented fairly standard concepts in medieval commercial law. Any firm specializing in major corporate transactions should have been able to interpret them without significant difficulty. The partners exchanged nervous glances. This was clearly heading somewhere unpleasant, but none of them could figure out exactly where. In fact, Sarah continued, we've learned that someone in your organization was able to provide a complete and accurate analysis of those sections. Someone who recognized the text as being derived from Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, specifically the Digesti, with modifications incorporating medieval canon law interpretations. Richard's face went white as he realized where this conversation was heading. I'm not sure I understand. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Sarah said, her voice cutting through Richard's attempted deflection. Ph.D. in medieval history from Oxford University, specializing in the development of commercial law from Roman times through the Renaissance. J.D. from Harvard Law School, summa cum laude, former editor of the Harvard Law Review. Author of the definitive scholarly work on the influence of Justinian's Code on modern corporate law. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan Hayes looked as if he had been physically struck. David Chen's face had gone ashen. Thomas Bradford stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Patricia Whitman's carefully composed expression had cracked completely, revealing shock and dawning horror. For the past 3 years, Sarah continued, Dr. Thompson has been conducting a comprehensive assessment of Sterling & Associates on behalf of Morrison Industries and several other major corporations. His assignment was to evaluate your firm's actual competence, ethical standards, and cultural dynamics before we entrusted you with critical business matters. Richard Sterling's voice came out as barely a whisper. The janitor was working for you? Dr. Thompson's undercover work has provided us with extensive documentation of your firm's practices, the general counsel interjected, including recordings of confidential client conversations, evidence of fraudulent billing practices, and detailed records of how your firm treats employees and service workers. Sarah pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be an extensive report. Quote, Sterling & Associates has consistently demonstrated a pattern of taking on cases beyond their actual capabilities, then relying on social connections and intimidation to avoid accountability when problems arise. Their billing practices include charges for work never performed, and their ethical standards appear to be entirely situational. The head of corporate security took over, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years investigating corporate fraud. Dr. Thompson's investigation has also revealed your recent overtures to Blackstone and Reed and Continental Legal Services firms with documented histories of ethical violations and criminal associations. It appears Sterling & Associates has been more interested in expanding revenue streams than maintaining professional standards. Richard Sterling, the man who had spent his entire life believing in his own superiority, sat in stunned silence as his world collapsed around him. The casual cruelty he had displayed toward Marcus, the mockery, the assumption of intellectual superiority, the reflexive dismissal of someone he considered beneath him, had just cost him everything. But the background check, Patricia Whitman stammered. His employment records showed he was just a high school graduate. Dr. Thompson's cover identity was carefully constructed, Sarah explained. Marcus Thompson, the janitor, exists on paper, but the real person behind that identity is one of the most respected legal scholars in the country. He's conducted similar assessments for Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries. The conference room door opened, and Marcus Thompson entered, but not the Marcus Thompson they knew. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by an impeccably tailored navy suit. Gone was the deferential posture, replaced by the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in academic and corporate settings. Gone was the apologetic smile, replaced by the serious expression of a professional delivering an unfavorable assessment. "Gentlemen, Ms. Whitman," Marcus said, his voice carrying none of the hesitant politeness they remembered. "I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary to observe your firm's actual character rather than the performance you might have put on for a known evaluation." Richard Sterling found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. This is entrapment, corporate espionage. You can't." "Actually, we can," the general counsel interrupted. "Dr. Thompson's activities were entirely legal. He was hired as a legitimate employee of Morrison Janitorial Services, which has a contract to provide cleaning services to this building. His observation of conversations in common areas and his analysis of documents discarded in trash receptacles fall well within the bounds of legal investigation." Marcus stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the conference table. This report documents 3 years of systematic ethical violations, professional incompetence, and cultural toxicity at Sterling and Associates. Your treatment of me on Tuesday was simply the final confirmation of patterns we had already identified. The Latin document, Thomas Bradford said weakly, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. It was a test. Every aspect of this engagement has been a test, Sarah confirmed. The contract language, the timeline pressures, the complexity of the legal issues involved, all designed to evaluate how your firm responds to challenges that require actual expertise rather than just social connections. Marcus opened the folder and began displaying photographs, audio transcripts, and financial records. Mr. Sterling, your comment about checking my papers and your assumption that I was an undocumented immigrant revealed both casual racism and a fundamental ignorance of employment law. Ms. Whitman, your participation in the mockery despite being the HR director showed a complete abandonment of professional responsibility. He continued through the evidence methodically, clinically. Mr. Hayes, your history of falsifying time records and billing clients for work performed by paralegal staff. Mr. Chen, your manipulation of expense reports and kickback arrangements with preferred vendors. Mr. Bradford, your systematic harassment of female associates and your family's financial connections to 3 companies currently under federal investigation. The partners sat in horrified silence as Marcus laid out evidence of wrongdoing they thought had been carefully hidden. Years of careful documentation, recorded conversations, and financial analysis had created an unassailable case against each of them. Morrison Industries will not be engaging Sterling and Associates for any legal services, Sarah announced. Furthermore, copies of Dr. Thompson's report are being shared with the New York State Bar Association, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. Additionally, the head of corporate security added, we will be recommending to our industry partners that they reconsider any existing relationships with your firm. Dr. Thompson's findings suggest that Sterling and Associates represents an unacceptable risk for any major corporation. Richard Sterling's $50 million net worth, his family's 4-generation legacy, his position as managing partner of one of New York's most prestigious law firms. All of it was crumbling before his eyes because he had chosen to mock a man for being different from him, for working with his hands instead of his connections. Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave. There's an important lesson here, he said, addressing the group one final time. Intelligence, education, and worth aren't determined by someone's job title or social status. The man you dismissed as intellectually inferior has more advanced degrees than all of you combined. The cleaning lady or janitor might be the most qualified person in the room. As Marcus walked toward the door, he paused and looked back at Richard Sterling. You asked me to read something in Latin, Mr. Sterling. Here's something appropriate for this moment. Sic transit gloria mundi. Do you know what that means? Richard shook his head numbly. Thus passes the glory of the world, Marcus translated. Your father would have known that. He was a classics major at Princeton, class of 1968, just like William Morrison, Jr. They were roommates, actually. That's how this whole investigation began. Mr. Morrison's concerns about what had happened to his old friend's law firm. And with that revelation, that their downfall had been orchestrated by the son of their founder's college roommate, a man who remembered when Sterling and Associates had stood for something better than prejudice and arrogance, Marcus Thompson walked out of their lives forever, leaving behind the ruins of their careers and the knowledge that their cruelty had finally found its match in justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.